Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to My Jewish Learnings Daf Yomi week in review. This morning, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Sarah Ronas to steer us real quickly around 7 pages of Yevamot. I'll hand it to you.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. The last time I joined you was the very first week we did Yevamot, our very start of Yevamot. And now we're not there, but we're almost halfway through. So I'd love to start, as I see some folks introducing themselves in the chat. I'd also love it if we could drop some of your reactions to what you learned this week. I'm going to be honest, I think Yevamot is kind of growing on me in surprising ways.
See if anyone else feels that way.
It could just be me. That's okay too.
I think we got used to at the end of Moed having really snappy tractates. And with 30 days and we've completed a tractate. And now not only is the subject matter very different and in some ways very difficult and in some ways very, like intellectually difficult and also sometimes emotionally difficult, but also we aren't getting that little ding of accomplishment every month that says, yeah, I finished another tractate of Talmud, another volume on the shelf.
Yeah. And
but you're getting some people agreeing with you.
Yeah. Diana says it's growing on her as well. And other folks too, right? Saying I liked it way better than in past weeks. Too many details. I get it. Yes, right. Norman, you're saying it did get more interesting, but also more challenging. And I think that is definitely true. Oh, good. I'm so glad it's not me. It's not just me, I mean. Yeah, yes, Susan, getting to some topics that aren't a choice between turgid and offensive.
As an editor of these pieces, I'm also a little less stressed that we're going to have what to say and that we're going to handle this material, right? Because we think about this in the office, like how do we handle this material and present it in a way that's useful and fair? And so
yeah,
we're also calming down on our end here.
Oh, I'm sure. Yes. And David, I so appreciate the where are the good stories. I will say my favorite story in our week that we just did is the story of Beloria's enslaved people. That one just gave us such insight into people we don't usually get insight into. So I will say there aren't as many stories, but the stories that we get are pretty wonderful in my estimation. So today I want to talk a little bit. I found that this week's Dapim sort of fit into two general categories. The first part is an extended discussion about conversion, and then the second part offers a number of questions about non-standard forms of acquiring a yevama. And so in our hour together, I want to really focus on the first part. And I'm gonna eventually share my screen and show you a PowerPoint. And so I'm putting a link to the PowerPoint in the chat if you'd like to save it for later or annotate as we go. I will show it up on the screen, so you don't need to multi-screen, but just so that you have it. It's interesting to me because I think so often when people think about Jewishness, we think about really strict boundaries, right? There's us versus them, or them versus us. There's Jew versus non-Jew. There are these really sort of clear lines that many of us experience, whether we are Jewish or not Jewish, or in the process of becoming Jewish, right? We assume that there are these very clear lines. And I think we see that in particular in the actual speech that the Gemara gives to converts. So let me figure out how to share my screen. Give me 10 seconds. Here we go. So if we look at the speech that the Gemara gives to converts, and this is familiar, I just put it up here. The sages taught a convert who comes to convert at the present time, they say to him, What did you see that motivated you to come to convert? Don't you know that the Jewish people at the present time are anguished, suppressed, despised, and harassed, and hardships come upon them? And he says, I know, and I am unworthy, right? I am not worthy to be part of this community. So it's not a question of, I'm financially motivated or power motivated, but I genuinely am spiritually committed to being a part of this community. Then they accept him immediately and begin the process of conversion. And, this speech makes it really clear, right? There are Jews, there are non-Jews. They have very different ways of existing in the world. And, never the twain shall meet, except in these extremely rare cases. And Pepita, I really appreciate in the chat has pointed out that this question still gets asked, right? These rituals as described are still part of many denominations' conversion experiences today. So thank you for that, yes. Now, the more we read in today's Daf, though, or in this week's Daf, the more we actually see that the boundaries are a lot more fuzzy than this speech suggests. And I want to look at two examples with you. So the first is this fuzziness of if a conversion process has multiple steps, people who are halfway through the steps, right? What do you do if you're halfway through the steps? So here again, we see, right, the case is a convert, right? If we're talking about male converts who are required, according to the Talmud, to both circumcise and immerse, what happens if they only do one of those things, right? What are they in that status, right? And personally, I kind of chuckled a little bit at this one, right? So the sages taught a convert who was circumcised but did not immerse. Rabbi Eliezer says this is a convert, as so we found with our forefathers, that they were circumcised but not immersed, right? I mean, not to shock anyone here, but there weren't mikvahs in the desert, and so they were circumcising but not immersing. And Rabbi Eliezer says, and those people really were converts. They had already converted. What about the flip side? Immersed but not circumcised. Rabbi Yehoshua says this is a convert, as so we found with our foremothers, that they immersed but were not circumcised. Fact, right? Absolutely. If we think about people like Rebecca or Rachel or Leah, who are theoretically from a non-Israelite family, though the Israelites weren't really a thing yet, but they are from an outside family coming in. They are not circumcised, and so, but they are still part of the Israelite family once they marry in. And the rabbis say, whether he immersed but was not circumcised, or whether he was circumcised but did not immerse, he is not a convert until he is circumcised and he immerses. Right? The rabbis here are working to eliminate that fuzziness, regardless of which of these things you are doing. Doesn't matter. You got to do both in order to be circumcised. In order to be Jewish. And I want to be clear, right? I want to be clear that the he in the rabbi's position is intentional. So they later on in the Talmud's discussion, they note that this is only true for people who are obligated in circumcision, right? So people who are not obligated in circumcision are converts just after immersion. But if you can be circumcised, you got to do both before you're Jewish. And I agree. I don't remember who it was, but somebody said they seem to be talking past each other. And fact, right? What we actually see here is disagreements, right? We see three different opinions about this question. And spoiler alert, we follow the rabbis here, right? We've got this potential for fuzziness, and the rabbis say, no, we need to make this clearer. So that's one example. But then there are other kinds of fuzzy boundaries that the rabbis actually encode in the law. So let's look at one of those. And this one, I hope as you were reading the emails, I don't remember who it was, but somebody wrote a beautiful piece about this text. And Rachel, if you remember the name of the person who wrote it, feel free to unmute and let's give that person some credit. But
I'll go check. Just a minute.
Wonderful. There is a real value in giving credit to people who have these insights. But as we've seen, right, there is this weird category of a ger toshav who is a person who observes certain mitzvot and has certain protections in the law and is not Jewish. And not only is not Jewish, is not in the process of converting, right, is something else. And so here we have these people who are presumably living in community, maybe observing some of the mitzvot. We're not quite sure which mitzvot, but, let's be perfectly honest, observing mitzvot can be incredibly spiritually fulfilling, but it asks a lot of people. And so this is somebody who's committed to that and doesn't actually seem to be interested in being fully Jewish, whatever that means, and still has these legal protections. And I'm curious what other folks, Rabbi Seth Goren, thank you, Steve. And my Jewish learning, wonderful, thank you. And I think what we're seeing here is this really interesting fuzzy category, which most communities today don't really operate with, but for the Talmud kind of is. And I'm curious for folks, as you were reading this, or as you were reading Rabbi Goren's piece, what were your reactions to this piece? Did anybody have any reactions to this particular idea as you were going through the daf? Feel free to drop that in the chat.
If you want also to raise your hands when Dr. Onis asks the question, I can monitor that and call on people for you if that would be easier than chatting a long thought.
Wonderful, thank you. I can't see all of the things. Yes. Janine, what an important point, right? We're thinking here, that mitzvah in the Torah seems to be for everyone. And in some ways, the rabbis here are restricting it to non-Jews who keep mitzvot of some kinds. And so on the one hand, right, it seems actually restrictive. Now, Saul, I think that's how to pronounce that. If I'm wrong, feel free to correct me, points out that ger toshav is a function of having sovereignty, that it maybe only matters when you're in control of a community or a country. And I think there are certain ways we might think about it that way, but I think it might actually be an interesting category to think with in Jewish communities which are embedded in a larger society too, right? I think it can be, we can think about how that has real legal implications if you're trying to set up a theocracy, which is what the Torah in these texts is doing. But I also think it's worth thinking, okay, well, what does this do for us today, right? Yeah, wonderful, thank you all. So, yes, and Sylvia, you're so right. There are so many people in so many of our lives who spend a lot of time being, as you put it, Jewish-ish, right? Jewish-ish. And I think that what we're seeing is the rabbis know that. Maybe they're not necessarily thinking of it in terms of somebody married to a Jewish person. They're probably thinking about this more in terms of freestanding communities that have freestanding families that have kind of bought in partially, but they know there are lots of people who are Jewish-ish, and they also know that that means that we have to take seriously what that means for our laws and our way of life. Wonderful. So I think what we're seeing here is, on the one hand, you have this really strict, like, in the conversion, there's us, there's them, there's totally different ways of being in the world. And if you're going to transition from one to the other, it's an absolute break. And we also see that the rabbis are working to enforce those divisions with how they're describing conversion. But here we see some of that fuzziness kind of continuing and being enshrined in the law. Now, so then how about once somebody has converted, right? If we've got this fuzzy boundary, then what is the position of the convert within the Jewish people? Now here, we get some really harsh statements about converts in these texts, right? We get some very complicated, maybe even cruel statements about converts. And what are we supposed to do with those? And here I want to highlight in particular this passage from Yevamot 48b, where we learn in a Braita, Rabbi Hanania, son of Rabban Gamliel, says, "Why are converts at the present time tormented and hardships come upon them? Because they did not observe the 7 Noahide mitzvot." So non-Jews are obligated in 7 mitzvot, pretty basic, like don't murder, set up courts kinds of things. And this Rabbi Hanania seems to say that the people who converted had not followed those laws, and that's why they have a really hard time once they've converted. Rabbi Yossi says, a convert who converted is like a child just born, right? Like, no, you're not liable for anything that happened pre-conversion. This is a renewal of oneself. So rather, why are they tormented? Because they are not well versed in the intricacies of the mitzvot, right? They're just not quite sure what to do, and so sometimes they get it wrong, and that leads to consequences. Abba Hanan says in the name of Rabbi Elazar, because they observe not out of love, but only out of fear. Right? Because when they're, the highest level of observance is to observe out of love, and Abba Hanan says, well, no, they're mostly scared of punishment, and they're not quite at the love level. And I'm going to be honest, it's not clear to me that Abba Hanan knew very many converts, because choosing to be a part of the Jewish people and to take on this community seems like a profound act of love to me. But he doesn't seem to see it that way. Let's keep going. There's a little bit more of the text. Others say it is because they waited before entering under the wings of the divine presence. Right? Maybe they should have actually converted earlier. If I saw somebody earlier say, you know, I was already a part of the Jewish people, my soul was at Sinai, is a thing that sometimes people say. And if that's true, like, what were they waiting for, according to others? Rabbi Abahu said, and some say it was Rabbi Hanina, what is the verse, the Lord shall recompense your work and your reward shall be complete from God, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, right? You're supposed to come as soon as you can. And apparently others and Rabbi Abahu point out, like, maybe you didn't come as soon as you really could. Now, I'm seeing some really important reactions in the chat. So I want to sort of name some of them. Devora says, some converts today are still given a hard time. Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is a real issue that the Jewish community needs to be wrestling with in important ways. I want to point out, if we just go back for 1 second, here, Rabbi Hanania's question, why are converts at the present time tormented and hardships come upon them, is not prescriptive, it's descriptive. So he's not saying we should be tormenting converts or this is the right way. He's saying this is what is happening. How do we explain the world that we are currently in? Which is a very different question than the question of what should our world look like, And I also want to point out that these traditions are cited as Baraitas. Baraitas are earlier traditions that are located in what was at the time the Roman province of Palestine. And there were real laws against converting to Judaism and real stigmas and challenges with that when the Roman Empire becomes Christian. And so it is actually very true that in the Roman Empire, there are real torments and hardships for people who are choosing to become Jewish. So this, I want to be really clear that this is descriptive of an actual reality at the time, which I think several of you are pointing out is unfortunately still socially true today. But it is not prescriptive. And that means that we get the choice to say, and what should it look like in our world? Now, I want to also point out, here's where I want to sort of end, and then we can open it up for 5 minutes of really interesting conversation. I want to point out a really interesting wordplay. Well, and here Pepita says, I thought he was talking about Jews mistreating converts, not the outside world. Well, this is, I always tell my students, when you use the passive voice, it's not clear who the actor is. And if we look at these phrases, it's all about things happening to converts, not Jews doing these things to converts. That is an excellent, Aaron says, if the Romans are creating these hardships, why are the rabbis blaming the converts themselves? And the answer is because the rabbis think that God is in control of everything. And that if bad things are happening, it's got to be part of a divine plan that has a reason. And here what we're seeing is they're giving some different reasons that my sense is most of us don't really like. But I want to point something out, a really interesting wordplay as we are going through this. And here, it's a parallel between the Breita and what the court is supposed to tell the person in the process of converting, right? And here, let's go back, and I underlined, right? Why are converts at the present time tormented and hardships come upon them? And don't you know that the Jewish people at the present time are anguished, suppressed, despised, and harassed, and hardships come upon them? And I think part of what we're seeing is with this wordplay or with this parallel, I'm going to make my own verbal analogy here, my own Gezerah Shava, and say that perhaps part of what is happening is, well, converts become part of the Jewish people and then have the Jewish people's experiences, right? And maybe it's not a sign that something bad happened to them before they converted or that they made a bad decision, but that part of becoming Jewish is living the world of Jews, the good and the bad. And I saw somebody in the chat note that their rabbi always tells prospective converts about, the dangers of anti-Semitism. I think this might point out that converts are, in fact, Jews. And so they live with the joys and the blessings and the challenges and traumas of the Jewish people as well here. And so that's what I wanted to sort of think through. All of these really interesting ways that the rabbis are creating really strong boundaries between Jews and non-Jews, but at the same time, really recognizing both fuzziness and ways that those boundaries can lead to profound transformation in someone's identity. So we have a couple of minutes now for questions or comments. I'm going to look in the chat for some comments, but please drop some questions in if you have them or raise your hand. Uriel says, I've noticed the racism expressed towards Black and Indigenous people of color who are converts, and I think that's absolutely true. I think stigma happens around being a convert, but that stigma is often intersecting with other kinds of identities in ways that are unequal and really toxic. I think there's a lot of really good work being done right now by networks of Jews of color working to help other Jews think through this, but there is a lot more work to be done there. I'm noting somebody Susan posted a converts Bill of Rights. I think that's definitely right. People who are converts, as being a convert is destigmatized, ideally, or is becoming destigmatized. We're seeing that. I totally lost it. Sorry, the coffee apparently hasn't hit. Oh, we're seeing that converts are being expressly describing what they need and what good treatment should look like for them. I'm seeing
we have a hand too.
Yeah. Yep. Do you want to unmute?
Yep. This is Herbert.
Yes. I just wanted to bring out the phrase that a famous historian once used, and that is the lachrymose history of Jews, which is what seems to be driving us more than anything else.
Wonderful. So, Herbert, you don't know this, but you have just stepped into, or maybe you do know this, that you are stepping into a major 20th century debate about how historians see the Jewish people. And it is absolutely true that some Jewish historians in the 1900s and the early 20th century really argued that the Jewish people's history was lachrymose. And for those who don't know that word, because it's one of those funny words, lachrymose meaning tears, right? Meaning sad. Other scholars point out at the same time that, depending on which pieces we pull out, it's going to look lachrymose or it's going to look creative and exciting and tremendously positive. And I think what that really points out is that all of this is very complicated. And part of what perhaps being a responsible person leading people into conversion is pointing out that if all you're seeing is the good parts, you are not fully understanding what you're joining. But I also think that part of what we're seeing in this whole discussion is if all you're seeing is the bad parts, you're also not seeing the fullness of Jewish experience. And so thinking about what does conscious and intentional decision-making look like, certainly it involves having all the information. Yeah. I do see some other questions, but I also know it's 9 o'clock. And I am guessing that or 10 o'clock where you are. So I want to wish everybody a wonderful day and a joyful, challenging journey through the rest of Yevamot.
We got quite a few weeks to go, which means that we will see you here again next week. And of course, tomorrow in your inbox. Thank you so much, Dr. Ronas, for steering us around some intellectually and emotionally challenging texts. And thank you all for some really interesting and thoughtful discussion. We really appreciate it. It was great to see you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye, everyone.